Page 564 continued. Features of 20th century English poetry. After 1900, the English literary scene becomes terribly chaotic. In the field of poetry, as also in other fields of literature, we find a tremendous activity. Thousands of poems are written and thousands published every day. The cells are indeed limited, but almost every poet, however minor, does find some audience. The chaos in the field of poetry is due to the fact that in modern times no literary tradition is respected at all, and on the contrary, all emphasis is made to fall on individualism for whatever it may be worth. Page 565. When every man navigates his poetic craft by the light of his own individuality and his personal sense of direction, the voyage becomes adventurous and therefore interesting. But shipwrecks are many. That is why in the modern age we are familiar all too well with the jetsam and flotsam of literature. The decline, tradition and innovation. Many have sincerely felt that in the 20th century no great poetry was written, and none is being written now in the 21st century. As a critic has put it, there have been many poetic persons in the 20th century, but no poets. It is said that as civilization advances, poetry declines. Poetry indeed has declined, though it is somewhat debatable if civilization has advanced. At the beginning of the 20th century at least, there was no poet of any stature. Thus, A.C. Ward in 20th century literature avers, quote, "When the 20th century opened, Tennyson had been dead 9 years, and there was a widespread impression that English poetry had died with him," unquote, stop. He further says, quote, "The poetry of the period shows a general decline, not in general level of execution, but in genius and breadth of range," unquote, stop. But he admits finally, quote, "There has been no dearth of great poets or great poems that will stand the test of time and become a part of the imperishable literary heritage of England," unquote, stop, para. As in modern painting, we find a lot of experimentation and innovation in modern poetry. Most of the poets have broken away from tradition completely, as they feel that poetry should change with the changing times. Many movements, schools, and groups have appeared and disappeared over the years. Imagism, surrealism, and the so-called apocalypse school have had their day. Some poets, mostly belonging to the early years of the century, remained, on the other hand, sticking to the traditions of Tennyson, Browning, Arnold, etc. Among these poets may be mentioned Robert Bridges, William Watson, and Sir Henry Newbolt. Still, many more combine tradition with innovation. A.E. Housman, Housman, for instance, poured his most withering and oppressive pessimism, which appears to be modern, into the mold of the ballad, one of the oldest of literary forms. Even T.S. Eliot, who with Hume, Hulme, Hopkins, and Ezra Pound has been a tremendous shaping influence on modern poetry, looks too often to Donne and the fellow metaphysicals. Thus, in a word, even innovators are influenced little or much by the poets before them. Modern themes. Modern poetry exercises a great freedom in the choice of themes. Gone are days when it was believed that the job of the poet was only to create, quote, beauty, unquote, stop. T.S. Eliot offers a representative view, quote, "The essential advantage of a poet is not to have beautiful world with which to deal, colon. It is to be able to see beneath both beauty and ugliness, semicolon. to see the boredom and the horror and the glory, unquote, stop. He is free to write poems on themes ranging from kings to cabbages and from the cosmos to a pin's head. Some poems have been written on pretty unpromising subjects which are peculiar to our machine age. Consider, for instance, such poems as Richard Aldington's Machine Guns, Kenneth Ashley's Goods Train at Night, Sheila Smead's The Ballad of a Motor Bus, and Sir Edmund Gosse's The Charcoal Burner. Para. Unflinching realism. This thematic revolution is indicative of the unflinching realism of the poets of the 20th century. Pastoralism, romanticism, and such like tendencies are things of the irretrievable past. Gone are the days of piping shepherds, quote, piping down the valleys green, unquote, comma, the nights cantering on moonlit heaths, and damsels with dulcet dulcimars. As Ronald Bottrell wistfully observes, quote, nightingales, sunset, or the meanest flower were formerly the potentialities of poetry. But now what have they to do with one another, with Dionysius or with me? Para. The searching realism of modern poets often brings them face to face with repulsive facts which would have scandalized a goody-goody Victorian. But our poets handle them most daringly. Prostitution, war, slum dwellers, and other such unpoetic themes find adequate treatment in modern poetry. The 20th century witnessed two terrible holocausts in the two global wars. The terror, ugliness, and brutality of war became a major theme in the poetry of, quote, the war poets, unquote, like Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, who themselves fought as soldiers. Bitter satire permeates the former's poems like, quote, counterattack, unquote, question mark, quote, set out to present in brutal verse the realities of war without gloss or evasion, unquote, and, quote, suicide in trenches, unquote, stop. In the latter, he refers to the suicide of a young soldier. Page 566. Quote, in the winter trenches, cowed and glum, with cramps and lice and lack of rum, he put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. Sneak home and pray you will never know the hell where youth and laughter go. Stop, unquote, para. Some war poets, such as Rupert Brooke, however, seem to have loved war as a test of their valiance and patriotism, and they treated it in their poetry accordingly. Para. Pessimism. The two wars and impending danger of a third, and perhaps the last, cast a gloomy shadow on much of the poetry of the 20th century. Well was the modern age been called, quote, the age of anxiety, unquote, stop. In spite of our material prosperity, we are full of tensions and anxieties which are almost an inseparable feature of modern living. Add to them the disappearance of religious faith. A note of disillusionment and autumnal gloom is then natural in poetry. This note can be heard in the poetry of many major poets like Hoseman, Hardy, Huxley, and T.S. Eliot. Quote, God's in his heaven, unquote, type of optimism is a thing of the past. Hoseman refers to the supreme power in this most blasphemous phrase, quote, whatever brute or blackguard made the world, unquote, comma. Hardy, in his greatest work, The Dynasts, expresses his disbelief in God and his concept of determinism. Huxley was manifestly and professedly an agnostic. T.S. Eliot was quite religious, but his attitude towards life, as we find it, in such poems as The Waste Land and The Hollow Men is far from optimistic. To quote a few lines from the latter, "We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dried voices when we whisper together are quiet and meaningless as wind in dry grass," stop unquote, para. The pessimism of 20th century poets is not of the nature of the somewhat stylized melancholy of Shelley or what David Deutsch describes as, quote, "the Tennysonian elegiac mode with its lingering enjoyment of self-pity," unquote, stop. It is more intellectual and more impersonal. Para. Humanitarianism, this pessimistic realization of the sad realities of life, is partly responsible for the note of fellow feeling and humanitarianism which is to be heard in the work of some 20th century poets. The realization of human suffering spurs them to align themselves with the suffering. Even in the Victorian age, there were poets like Thomson, Hood, and Mrs. Browning who demanded justice for the downtrodden. The 20th century poets like Galsworthy, Gibson, and Masefield also voiced their indignation against social repression. In Gibson's Farm Holiday, we notice the grim struggle for existence waged endlessly by workers living from hand to mouth. Quote, "All life moving to one measure, daily bread, bread of life and bread of labor, bread of bitterness and bread of sorrow, hand to mouth and no tomorrow, death for housemate, death for neighbor," unquote. Masefield in Consecration thus unveils the stark realities of life. Quote, "Others may sing of wire and wealth and the mirth, the portly presence of potentiates goodly in girth. Mine be the dirt and the dross, the dust and scum of the earth," unquote, stop. Para. Galsworthy in Stupidity Street strikes a note of sympathy for birds. Quote, "I saw with open eyes singing birds sweet, sold in the shops for people to eat, sold in the shops of Stupidity Street," unquote. In their solicitousness for the working classes, some 20th century English poets went over to the side of radical socialism and even communism. Para. Romantic tendency. Such prosaic social concern is basically inimical to all romantic tendency. Most poets, as we have said earlier, scorn all romanticism. Even the subdued king of romanticism, as in Tennyson, Hume, a major influence on Eliot and others, asserted in his essay, quote, "Romanticism and classicism. Romanticism and classicism," unquote, is in the New Age. Colon, quote, "I object to the sloppiness which doesn't consider that a poem is a poem unless it is moaning or whining about something or other," unquote, stop. Others also freely tilted against the traditional romanticism. Still, a few others manifest unmistakable romantic tendencies. Among these poets may be mentioned Walter de la Mare, W.B. Yeats, John Masefield, James Elroy Flecker, and Edward Thomas. Page 567. Yeats' imagery is often redolent of mythical splendor. Flecker, in his poetic drama Hassan, tries to evoke the Oriental splendor through, quote, "in a style stripped of romantic excess and a mood purged of romantic subjectivity," unquote, stop. However, the most important romantic poet of all is de la Mare, who is preeminently a poet of childhood and supernaturalism. To quote Chew, some of his poems, quote, where ghosts and demons walk beneath a waning moon, comma, are morbid, comma, terrible, comma, and dreadful, unquote, stop. But some others, in which the world of nonsense intermingles with the world of dreams, are quite delightful, especially to children. Para, nature. Another, quote, romantic tendency to be found in some 20th century poets is interest in nature, stop. Nature fascinates some poets because she offers such a wonderful contrast with the hubbub and ugliness of an industrialized and over-sophisticated age. There is no unquote sign. Quote, in the face of modern industrialism, unquote, says A.C. Ward, quote, they solace their souls by retiring to the country and celebrating the beauties of unspoiled nature, unquote, stop. Such poets as Masefield, Robert Bridges, W.E. Davis, and Edmund Blunden may not find any mystic significance in nature, but they are all the same charmed by her unsophisticated beauty. Masefield in Sea Fever expresses a strong desire to run away from the dreary life into, quote, the lonely sea and the sky, unquote, stop. Edmund Blunden points his finger lovingly at the little noticed things of nature. Davis's poetry has the feature of childlike curiosity in the natural objects everybody finds around himself. Para, religion and mysticism. Religion and mysticism also find a place in the work of some poets of the 20th century. Coventry Patmore, and Francis Thompson, who wrote religious poetry towards the end of the preceding century, seem to have inspired a number of poets in this century. The name of Mrs. Alice Meynell, Meynell, deserves to be mentioned. In the poetry of the Jesuit Gerald Manley Hopkins, too, we have something religious now and then. Ralph Hodgson's The Song of Honor is a notable poem pulsating with religious feelings. Even in the poetry of such poets as Yeats, there are mystical strains. Para. Complexity and psychological profundity. Complexity and psychological profundity are some other qualities of the more representative poetry of the 20th century. The reaction against the earlier naivety of poetry was initiated by Eliot and Ezra Pound in the second decade of the 20th century. The publication of Hopkins's work in 1918 was also a force in the new direction. Deiches observes, quote, complex, elusive, using abrupt contrast and shifting counter-suggestion to help to unfold the meaning, eliminating all conjunctive phrases or overt statements that might indicate the relation of one scene or situation to another, comma, depending entirely on, quote, the music of ideas, unquote, comma, on the pattern of symbolic suggestion set up as the poem moves, comma. Eliot's long poem, The Waste Land, 1922, was the first major example of the new poetry, comma, and it remains a watershed in both England and American literary history, unquote, stop, para. Ezra Pound, Emmy Lowell, and Hilda Doolittle, Americans, and Richard Aldington, an Englishman, were the pioneers of imagism in poetry. Visual images, before they were matured by intellect, were sought to be expressed by them without any respect for conventional phraseology. Moody and Lovett observe, quote, the images define poetry as the presentation of a visual situation in the fewest possible concrete words, comma, lightened of the burden of conventional adjectival padding, comma, and unhampered by general ideas or philosophical or moral speculations, unquote, stop. Form and substance were to be identical. As an instance of the Imagist poetry, consider the following lines from Hilda Doolittle's Garden. Quote, "O wind, rend open the heat, cut apart the heat, rend it to tatters, fruit cannot drop. Through this thick air, fruit cannot fall into heat that presses up and blunts the point of pears and rounds the grapes," unquote. Many of the major poets of the century showed the influence of the Imagist doctrines in their work. Para, diction and meter. This movement has also revolutionized the concept of poetic diction and meter. Traditional poetic diction, saccharine poeticisms, and even regular meter were discarded almost completely. As Moody and Lovett point out, quote, "Imagism did modern poetry a tremendous service by pointing the way to a renovation of the vocabulary of poetry and the necessity of ridding poetic technique of vague and empty verbiage and dishonest and windy generalities," unquote, stop, page 568. Though rhyme had almost completely gone, yet, as Deiches puts it, quote, "Rhythm freed from the artificial demands of metrical regularity," unquote, was all used. A language with flow and turn of common speech was mostly employed. Verse libre or free verse is the most usual mode of all serious poetry of today. In the 20th century, many experiments have been made on the technique and diction of poetry. Doughty, Doughty, for example, as Grierson and Smith put it, quote, "manhandled," unquote, English. The American poet Cummings refused to start every line of his poetry with a capital letter and so on. Many of such experiments have been interesting, but interesting only. Para. In the 20s, the English poetic scene was dominated by the modernists like T.S. Eliot and Pound. The traditionalist Georgians represented only a pleasant diversion as compared to the central current of modernism. After the 20s, all the new forces and trends defined themselves in relation to that central current alone. They were either for or against or partly this and partly that. The most important of these new forces, trends or movements were three, and in the following chronological order. 1. The Oxford poets or left-wing intellectuals. 2. Poets of the Apocalypse. 3. Movement poets. The Oxford poets. Let us consider these three one by one. The group of Oxford poets comprises the following. 1. W. E. Auden, 1907 to 1973. 2. Stephen Spender, 1909 to 95. 3. Cecil Day Lewis, 1904 to 72. 4. Louis MacNeice, 1907 to 1963. Para. All of them were connected with Oxford University and were more or less committed leftist and propagators of communist ideology. For them, poetry was not a pastime but a serious commitment to the realization of political aims. In its most didactic shape, poetry in their hands becomes a political action, a contribution to the proletarian struggle against the bourgeois and the ruling elite. That the Oxford poets were inclined to action rather than mere reflection and aesthetic creation is shown by the fact that at least two of them, for instance, Auden and Spender, were involved in the Spanish Civil War, with which England had no direct concern. This active involvement with the problems of the day gives the poetry of this group a special vitality and authenticity, but at the same time it makes it a little dated A.C. Ward rightly observes, quote, "The poetry of the 1930s was saturated in bloody sweat of that decade." Stop. This fact gives it a documentary importance which may seem, as time passes, to outweigh its poetic merit, ... The poet turned politician may serve his age as politician, but he may in so doing abrogate his more important function as visionary. Stop. While no poet can be unaware of temporalities, he is poet only in so far as he is in constant touch also with the eternities, applying to policy the measure of truth. Stop, unquote, para. Considered from the point of view of poetic technique, the Oxford poets were decidedly modernist. They show a strong influence of T.S. Eliot, who patronized them, and the imagists as also Hopkins and French symbolists. Excessive compression, bizarre similes and metaphors, which are often surrealistic, and metaphysical juxtapositions are some of the chief characteristics of their poetry. Interestingly, though they were champions of the masses as against the elite, they cannot really be called poets of the masses. Their work is too difficult, too intellectually demanding for the common people to be their cup of tea. Para. Now let us briefly consider these poets individually. Para. W. H. Auden is the guru of the Oxford group. It can be confidently said that next to Eliot, Auden is the most important poet of the 20th century. When he went up to Oxford University at the age of 18, he twice became editor of the journal Oxford Poetry. In 1956, he became professor of poetry at Oxford, but before that he immigrated to America in 1939 and acquired American citizenship in 1946. Para. In the 1930s, Auden was the voice of his generation. Linda Williams observes, quote, "His verse is full of topical reference to the social and international crisis of the time. It gives direct expression to the anxieties of the contemporary intelligentsia, as perhaps no other writing has done," unquote. R.G. Cox, C.O.X., points out, quote, "The immediate sensitiveness with which he has registered the changing moods." R.G. Cox points out, quote, "The immediate sensitiveness with which he has registered the changing moods and opinions of his time," unquote, stop. With the passage of time, Auden lost much of his leftist ideological sharpness, so much so that after 1940 he became committed to Anglo-Catholicism. Page 569, para. Spender was a passionately political poet. In his poetry, he also propagated the cause of the Republican in the Spanish Civil War. For some time, he remained a member of the Communist Party, but in 1950, he contributed to The God That Failed, a collection of anti-communist essays edited by R.H.S. Crossman. Unlike Auden, Spender does not flinch from expressing his deeper personal emotions. With all his political hardness, he has something of the romantic in him. Para. The early poetry of Day-Lewis was overtly propagandist, and he also supported the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. However, with the passage of time, he became more versatile and more personal and pastoral, putting one in mind of the Georgians and Hardy. In 1968, he became the Poet Laureate. Para. An Irishman by birth, MacNeice, M-A-C-N-E-I-C-E, Para. An Irishman by birth, MacNeice, M-A-C-N-E-I-E-E, associated himself with Auden. Spender, and Day Louis because he too had socialistic leaning. But unlike others, he was not a committed leftist. Linda Williams observes, quote, he excelled in witty, sensuous verse of rhythmical versatility and with a strong element of caustic pessimism, unquote, stop. Para. Poets of the Apocalypse. The Greek root of the word apocalypse signifies disclosure. In literature, apocalypse means a visionary composition, such as the Book of Revelation, the last book of the New Testament. Among English poets, Blake and Yeats are well known for their apocalyptic poetry, which tends to intimate truths and visions inaccessible to rational thinking. Para. In the history of 20th century poetry, quote, New Apocalypse, unquote, was the most powerful movement of the 40s. It was started by Dylan Thomas, 1914-53, and carried on into the 50s by his disciple W.S. Graham, 1918-86, and some others much less significant. The New Apocalypse was essentially a neo-romantic movement, and like the earlier romantic movement of Wordsworth, Coleridge, etc., was both a revolt and a revival. It revolted against both the classicist impersonality and conciseness of Eliot and Pound, as well as the propagandist concern of the school of Auden. Passion and emotion were to be restored to poetry, and dry rationality and excessive concern for form and linguistic precision were to be shown the door. Para. Dylan Thomas has indeed been a great poet of the 20th century. He can be very whimsical and exasperatingly obscure, but he is very forceful and genuine. There is often an incantatory element in his poetry which casts a spell on the reader despite all its obscurity. Consider, for example, his well-known poem, quote, Altar Wise by Owl-Light, unquote, comma, a sequence of sonnets. What exactly this poem is about is yet to be agreed upon by critics. Some say it is about Jesus, others that it is about Hercules, and still some others that it is about writings of a boy in love with shapes and shadows on his pillow. They would be of interest to another boily boy or a boily girl, unquote. Splendid muddle, comma, but interesting. Para. Graham's poetry is remarkably vigorous. It is mostly about problems of personal identity. He is often named with David Gascoigne, Cascoyne, and George Barker, as well as Dylan Thomas as a reviver of the romantic spirit in the 20th century. Para. The movement. It was but natural that the romantic excesses of the New Apocalypse should be challenged by new forces which disapproved of irrationality, indiscipline, whimsicality, mysticism, and looseness. This inevitable challenge came in the 50s from what are called, quote, New Lines, unquote, or, quote, movement, unquote, poets. New Lines 1956 was the title of the anthology of post-war poetry edited by Robert Conquest. The contributors to this volume came to be known as the, quote, movement poets, unquote, stop. Para. Rejecting the neo-romanticism of the New Apocalypse, the movement poets went back to their classicist predecessors like Eliot and Pound, and even farther back to the English Augustans like Dryden, Pope, and Johnson, and some even went back to Hardy and the Georgians. In Linda Williams' words, the work of the movement poets, quote, is characterized by thoughtfulness, irony, self-doubt, humility, and the search for completely honest feeling, stop. These qualities are in accord with the imaginative temper of Thomas Hardy's poetry, unquote, stop, para. Amis is better known as a novelist than as a poet. He was, unquote, an angry young man, unquote, of the 50s, who also became a movement poet. Both as poet and novelist, he has a middle-brow ethos. Enright is a novelist and critic as well as a poet. His poetry is markedly anti-romantic and humanistic. About Fuller, Linda Williams observes, quote, he began writing in the 1930s and published 2 volumes of poetry whilst he was in Royal Navy during Second World War, Cologne. The Middle of a War, 1942, and A Last Season, 1944. His first volume appeared in 1939, Stop, page 570. Subsequent texts have shown certain attributes of movement irony, but with a broader technical and emotional scope, as well as a tendency to experiment with versification, unquote, Stop. Davy is well known for his critical book Purity of Diction in English Verse 1952, which has been called, quote, the Bible of the movement, unquote, Stop. According to Linda Williams, his, quote, rational, cool, and technically pure poetry perhaps epitomizes the verse of the movement, unquote, Stop. Para. Philip Larkin is as distinguished a member of the movement as Auden was of the group of left-wing intellectuals or Thomas of the New Apocalypse. Larkin is a political conservative. Eschewing political radicalism, he shows concern for the humor and pathos, comedy and tragedy of everyday experiences of common men. He combines modernism and classicism. In one important respect, however, Larkin is against modernism, its emphasis on Catholicity and internationalism. In Linda Williams's words, quote, Philip Larkin exemplifies movement poetry, in his deflationary, perfectly formed phrases, in his almost xenophonic stance against other cultures and cultural forms, unquote, Stop. This makes him a somewhat parochial poet, but this parochialism is in perfect conformity with his general attitude of humility, which makes him fond of safety, order, self-discipline, and even a bit of brutality and boredom. The chapter ends here, followed by multiple choice questions.